This lecture carries on exactly where the last one left off, with writing problems. Writing feels like a solitary activity, but actually it's not. The next thing you have to teach the students is that writing is a social activity. Why is that? Because writing exists to be read. There's an implicit social link between the writer and the reader. Writing is actually a stylized way of talking to somebody else. And so a good writer needs to develop a way of talking in what we might call good manners, just as you have to be considerate to the person you're with when you're in everyday interaction. So in writing, you have to have good manners, in other words, to help the reader understand what it is you're trying to say. That's why I suggested previously that you should think about a parent or a friend when you're writing to make it more likely that your writing will be approachable and readable. And you should always remember that the chief purpose of writing is to be able to convey some information to somebody else who doesn't know about this subject yet. Now, it's often very difficult in an educational setting to get the students to feel that relationship because they know that the actual reader is going to be you, the teacher. So very often they depend upon your knowledge of the subject rather than spelling out clearly each link in the chain of reasoning. And I tell them repeatedly, you've got to write this paper in such a way that someone who knows less about the subject than you can nevertheless learn from it. That's the test of whether it's effective. Now, I also spend a great deal of time with students working on editing questions. I point out to the students that one of the things you've got to do as a writer is you've got to win the reader's confidence. And you're never going to be able to get the reader's confidence if your writing is full of grammatical errors or spelling errors. Students often complain to me when they get poor grades for writing assignments because they were full of careless writing mistakes. They say, "Oh, come on, Dr. Allett, this isn't an English class." And I say, "Well, no, it's not, but if you can't use the English language accurately, you'll never be able to persuade readers about anything. You won't seem trustworthy. So getting the writing exactly right, that's got to be your starting point." You have to teach students that the completion of a draft does not mean that they have completed the writing assignment. It's very, very difficult to convince students that once they've written it once, the project is not finished. That now what they've got to do, what they ought to do now, is go over it line by line, sentence by sentence, to get it exactly right. But it's an excellent habit to get into, and again, this applies equally in every kind of writing at every stage of your life, just as much in business as when you're still in college or school. Bad writing gives a very poor impression, and many common errors can be caught and corrected with just one careful reading or one careful rereading, so long as you know what it is you've got to look for. Apart from anything else, when you're an experienced writer, you start to realize, when I've got a draft, I've got something solid, something tangible to work with. Until I've got a draft, all I've got is a head full of possibilities. Some writers favor the idea of simply writing very freely the first time around, just getting it all down on paper any old how, so that they'll have something to work with. And it can be a liberating feeling. I'll ignore all the rules for the sake of getting something down, and then I'll go back and tighten it up. That system works as long as you do, in fact, do the tightening up work. Some writers find it helpful to speak their first draft into a tape recorder, and then do a transcription onto paper or onto the word processor. There are lots of ways of doing it, and obviously each writer has got to find the way that works well for him or for her. But whatever their method, editing is imperative, and having got a draft, then the hard editing work starts. Well, a great deal of common blunders can be recognized and can be put right by anyone who's willing to spend the time doing it. And incidentally, you may find the need to review some of the rules yourself as you work to improve your students' writing. There are some areas of writing which we all have problems with, but luckily there are lots of very, very good writing books out there which will help you with the actual mechanics. A problem I find constantly is the matter of verb tense inconsistency. And a student will write something like this. George Washington takes command of the Continental Army and finally defeated the British at Yorktown. Now, what happened there, the reason that sentence sounds wrong is because there's a verb tense inconsistency. It started out in the present tense, but it ended up in the past tense. Now, I think the reason the students often use the present tense, Washington takes command, is because they've seen a lot of television documentaries or docudramas which have this style, you're right there with them, and it actually shows an actor playing Washington and so on. Oh, that's got its uses, obviously. It makes things more vivid. But of course, you've got to be careful and consistent if you're going to do it. If you use the present tense, you need to carry on using it, at least for the duration of that sentence, or at least to make sure that you don't commit a grammatical error in switching tenses halfway through. For historical writing, I strongly frown upon this method of using the present tense because one of the things we're doing as historians is talking about what happened in the past. The verbs help us. Why should we decline the help that they're offering us? We should use the past tense to write about the past. Now, another thing I do in historical writing, but it's useful all over the place, is to teach students the use of the pluperfect tense. It goes like this. I offered him lunch, but he declined, saying that he had eaten earlier. In a sentence like that, had eaten is the pluperfect tense. In other words, what I'm saying is I in the present am talking about something I said. I offered him lunch, offered, that's a simple past tense, but he replied that he had eaten earlier. In other words, I'm sort of looking back twice. I'm looking back on my question to him, and I'm looking back on him telling me that he had done something earlier still. In other words, it gives you a kind of double backwardsness, the pluperfect tense. Yeah. It's very, very useful, and it comes up all the time in historical writing. Winston Churchill became Prime Minister in 1940 and was aware of mistakes that he had made during the First World War as First Lord of the Admiralty. Had made is the pluperfect tense. So I'm looking back on Churchill in 1940, who is himself looking back further. Now, when I mention this verb tense, most students have never heard of it, unless they're already hard at work with a foreign language, in which case it's much more likely that they will have studied grammar more systematically. But you can imagine that for historical writing, and for many other sorts of writing too, it's incredibly useful. Obviously, people will use that form of words without knowing what it is that they're actually doing, without realizing it. That's why the study of grammar is so useful, because it brings to self-consciousness things which otherwise we have a vague and general aware of. Students catch on to it. It's a lovely possibility. You also need to work in editing work to prevent the confusion of singular and plural inside the same sentence. And again, you often get sentences like this. The average Irish peasant lived in a filthy shack with the pigs, and they hated the absentee landlord. Now, you see, what happens in a sentence like this is it should be, he hated the landlord, because the average Irish peasant is a singular noun, and so you've got to maintain the singular all the way through. Or it should be plural all the way through. Typical Irish peasants lived in the shacks with the pigs, and they hated the landlord. It should be singular throughout or plural throughout. Now, one of the reasons that we have the confusion of singular and plural so often these days is, ironically, because of the rise of feminism and inclusive language. We've been encouraged over the last few decades to say his or her rather than simply his. In other words, there shouldn't always be the assumption that it's just men. But of course, the disadvantage with his or her is that if you have to use it several times in the same sentence, it sounds terribly cumbersome. And so some people have started using the word their, which is really a plural pronoun, as though it were a singular pronoun. So now you often see a sentence like this. Each customer wants their supermarket line to be the quickest. Using their, really, each is singular, so their, plural. That's actually an ungrammatical sentence. But it doesn't sound as bad as it would have done 30 years ago, because now we're used to the use of the word their as a singular pronoun, even though it really isn't. Anyway, that's itself an interesting example of the intricate relationship between language and reality that the students need to reflect on. So it's actually a teaching opportunity. You know, it gives you the chance to say, look at the way in which the feminist movement unexpectedly gave rise to a problem in the actual form of English grammar. Terrific. Nearly every writer, even very good ones, commonly makes spelling mistakes. Now, sadly, although computers in many respects are a wonderful gain, they're one of those technologies which have made our lives much easier in most ways, it does have some disadvantages, and one of them is spell check. Very often students think that if a word isn't shown up on the spell check, that means it must be spelled rightly. But of course, although spell check is good, it can be tricked. Very often you have words which sound the same but are spelled differently, or a word which isn't actually spelled wrongly but is used in the wrong place. 90% of our students use the words effect and affect wrong. They use them interchangeably. They're complicated words and they have an overlapping meaning. Effect can be a noun or a verb, and affect can be a noun or a verb, so that's a classic place where you're likely to make mistakes. One of the commonest mistakes I get is the use of the word L-E-A-D, lead, where what should be written is led, L-E-D. William Tecumseh Sherman was a forceful commander and he led his army to victory. But they actually write L-E-A-D, in other words, he lead his army to victory. Yeah, lead and led. It might be a spelling mistake, it might be a verb tense mistake. But students have got to learn it. If necessary, they've got to learn it simply from repetition and by heart. You've got to teach writers to avoid common grammatical errors that are perfectly acceptable in conversation, but in writing seem jarring. It's common for to have somebody say, "How do you feel?" "I feel real good." But to say real good in writing is unacceptable, I think. Tell the dog to lay down. When you're writing it, you need to say, tell the dog to lie down. The use of I or me, the rules for which nearly everybody gets wrong all the time. You need to know what the rules are so that when you're writing, especially if you're writing in a fairly formal context, you can get them right. Because if you don't know rules like that, your work is always going to look a bit amateurish. And if it looks amateurish, you're not going to win the confidence of the reader, especially the kind of reader who does know the rules in detail. Another problem, which is fun but difficult to work on effectively, is the question of mixed metaphors. And I'm sure you can all think of examples. By abusing his rival, the candidate shot himself in the foot, and all his hard work went down the drain. Yeah? Now, obviously, there, shot himself in the foot. There's uses for a metaphor like that, but not in the same sentence as the hard work went down the drain. Because then suddenly you start thinking about this comical juxtaposition rather than the author's intention, which was to alert you to the fact that the candidate had made a mistake. Now, there's a particular danger with what are called faded metaphors. That is, metaphors which are used so much that we often forget that they are metaphorical. Now, the best example of that is the use of the word focus. Focus, obviously, is a metaphor taken from optics. You've all looked through a camera lens and everything's been blurry, and then you've focused it and it's become sharp. But now we say so often, don't we, I'm going to focus on this. We forget that it's metaphorical. So somebody might say, if you really focus, you'll hit a home run on this project. See, it's still a mixed metaphor because it's taking a metaphor out of optics and a metaphor out of baseball and mixing them together. That may sound like picky, pedantic quibbling on my part, but be aware of the kind of metaphors you're using and discipline your metaphor use. This is even more necessary in the case of extended metaphors. Now, again, what often happens is that student writers, particularly the slightly more ambitious ones, often see an extended metaphor where over sometimes several paragraphs, an author beautifully maintains the metaphor, and they realize what a lovely thing it can be when it works right. And quite often they've had creative writing teachers who've encouraged this kind of thing. But in fact, they're very hard to manage unless you're an excellent writer. And again, unfortunately, you can inadvertently be comical when you're trying to create a dramatic effect. I once had a student who wrote something like this about the development of the welfare state. Something to this effect. The welfare state began as a small stream springing up in the early days of the New Deal in 1933. By World War II, government economic controls had grown into a river that cut a great valley through America. And in Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, it turned into a catastrophic flood that inundated the landscape. Bureaucrats were like rainstorms that swelled the flood, and welfare trickled into every part of American life. Well, by the time I'd read all that, I was chuckling, even though the student obviously had the intention of making a grand dramatic effect. I certainly don't mean that metaphors ought not to be used, or even that extended metaphors ought not, but that you need to be careful. In other words, don't turn Washington bureaucrats into great rainstorms. It just sounds a little bit silly. In fact, avoidance of of accidental comedy is itself a big problem. Quotations from student papers, very often I write down some of the funnier ones. Many did not survive the harsh journey west, but still they trekked on. Now, of course, what the student means in a case like this is that crossing the Oregon Trail was very, very difficult and many people died along the way, but that others kept trekking on. But by failing to make the necessary distinction, they sound as though the dead ones also carried on trekking. How about this? As farming communities grew in the Midwest, schoolhouses and bridges erupted. There's a very strange volcanic feeling about the idea of a schoolhouse erupting or a bridge. What the student's trying to get at is the idea that new communities and the infrastructure of new communities grew up very rapidly as the settlement developed. So the idea is right, but unfortunately the exact form of words has turned it into comedy. I also remember this from a student paper. For many of the Indian tribes, the buffalo was a scared animal. Of course, what the student meant was that it was a sacred animal. That's really just a very, very simple typing mistake. That scared is a word and sacred is a word. The spell check's not going to pick it up because there are circumstances in which a buffalo might be a scared animal. But in this case, the sentence which was meant seriously has become ridiculous because of insufficient careful editing. Students also, writers of all kinds, need to think about how word choice affects the reader's understanding. Small differences can have large consequences, especially in English, where we often have so many dozens of near synonyms, each one capable of expressing a different shade of meaning. There are some good thesauruses that you can use online and in print, and you need to encourage students to expand their vocabularies so that they use the language more precisely. But of course, the danger of the thesaurus is that students will find a strange and exotic word and use that when really it isn't the most suitable. So you've got to emphasize, choose the best word. Yeah? Think about words relating to dislike. We've got lots and lots of words for it in gradations. Dislike, deplore, abhor, revile, hate, loathe. There are lots of them. And so, in other words, you've got a spectrum to choose from. And your job, depending on the people you're talking about, is to choose the most suitable one. Or similarly with admiration or praise. Acknowledge, recognize, appreciate, laud, admire, praise, celebrate. There are a great string of them. We even have near synonyms for things like obscure, arcane, recondite, esoteric. Get students familiar with these words, let them use them, but remind them to use the right one at the right time. I've also found that in my own writing, and certainly in the writing of students, the first time round, the first draft, tends to have too many adjectives. I mentioned previously the no adjectives exercise, which seems to me very effective because it's one of the characteristic weaknesses that many of us have, is to write too many, particularly intensifiers like the word very and extremely. It's sometimes a good idea to impose on yourself and on your students the rule, you can never use the word very and you can never use the word extremely. See, first drafts tend to be rhetorically overheated, and they tend to press the reader too hard, particularly with the adjectives. And by contrast, if you've got a cooler diction, the sentences can sound more authoritative. I've seen thousands of sentences that look like this. The unpardonable Third Reich mercilessly and wickedly killed millions of defenseless, innocent, blameless people, even victimizing tiny children. Now, that's all true, but as written, it sounds very rhetorically overheated. A sentence with fewer adjectives and fewer splutterings actually would sound better. The Third Reich systematically exterminated entire categories of the population. The point's the same, and it's actually more believable because the reader has a feeling of your distance from it, that you're dispassionately describing what actually happened. This question of dispassionateness and objectiveness is a very important matter. In academic writing, which as professors we're chiefly concerned with, they've got to learn how to appear objective. Now, you saw me earlier on in one of the lectures talking with students about the author's tone of voice. I'd say to one student, what's this author's tone of voice? And very often the students didn't really know what I meant, unless the rhetoric was very heavy-handed in scorn or mockery or alarm. Sometimes when I ask the student, what's it sound like, what's the tone? The students say, well, it just sounds like history. And I think what they mean is, it's just got an academic tone. All right, there is an academic tone. It's a stylized form of writing. And students, to be good writers in the discipline in question, need to learn how to mimic that style of writing. In history, they need to sound Olympian. I often use this comparison. That your job is to sound like the king of all the gods. So you're up on Mount Olympus, and what you're doing is looking down at what the mortals did. These people did this, those people did that, these people did the other, and here's how they interacted, and here's what it all means. You're above it all. Rather than getting down with one of the groups and joining in with the historical struggle, you rise above it. It's difficult to create that tone of voice, and it's particularly difficult to do it without becoming a little bit cliched or a little bit boring. This is a central issue to developing as a good writer, moving from an adequate one onto one who's really effective. You need to be objective. You need to be dispassionate. You need to coolly weigh the pros and cons of a new project or a new proposal. You need to appear to be cool-headed. The reader reading your work needs to think, ah, yes, here's an author who's considered all the options and who's open-minded to the various possibilities. So strangely, part of learning to write well is actually a matter of learning mimicry. You need to learn how to mimic the style of writing which is characteristic of your type of business or your area of the law or this branch of physics. You master that mimicry because then you'll have authority as you write in that area. And the style of your writing, the tone of your writing, will show that you are in fact a member of that group, and that other members of the group will therefore listen to you because you sound right. And as I said, in a way these conventions are arbitrary, but in another sense there's good reasons for them developing as they have done. In my view, in general, the teaching of writing in schools has overemphasized creativity and underemphasized the importance of learning the right idiom for the type of writing you need to do. In every walk of life, certain types of writing just sound right, and they sound right because they correspond with that idiom. But that doesn't mean that there's no room for creativity. The creativity grows out of the imaginative use of a pre-existing style. And again, I can give you a comparison here. Think about ballet dancing. A ballet dancer has to learn, sometimes for years, how to do all the traditional techniques before he or she can begin to undertake creative dancing, which nevertheless is going to be recognized as ballet. But certainly, all the time, the great dancers are the ones who've totally mastered the formal idiom and then have been expressive and creative above and beyond it. To simply abandon the idiom or not think it matters at all will always mark you as an amateurish outsider. Another writing issue we have to think about is the question of jargon. Everybody says that they're opposed to jargon, but in practice, nearly everybody uses it. So it's worth thinking about where jargon is appropriate and where it's inappropriate. It actually does have a very, very useful place. We all need shorthand terms for common items within our particular area of expertise. In business, in the military, for example, if you listen to two soldiers talking to one another, they seem to talk almost entirely in acronyms. We're going to do a G26 on that B-15 because we need to make sure we've got the DD before the inspector gives it a 5-2. Yeah? What on earth does that mean? Well, of course, to an outsider, it doesn't mean anything at all. But the soldiers themselves are constantly working with pieces of machinery or weapons which are called G26s. And so for them, it makes perfect sense to use a cluster of shorthand terms like that, acronyms, because otherwise it's going to take them twice or three times as long simply to say something which is entirely clear in the shorthand version. But when one of these soldiers then appears before a congressional committee or talks to a journalist, it's important for him or her to remember that the audience doesn't know the acronyms and that therefore a different type of talking about it is appropriate. And similarly, if they're writing, to remember, if it's just a military audience, I can use them. If it isn't, I mustn't. That's the challenge for soldiers and for economists and literary critics and so on. Every walk of life has got its jargon. Within the discipline, it's fine. Beyond it, no good. When I'm teaching writing, I say to students, when you've written your first draft, read it aloud. You've heard me speaking in other contexts about reading aloud. It's vital with their own writing. Reading it aloud, even if they're alone, they'll catch the little linguistic infelicities that they'd miss if they were reading it to themselves. It just sounds wrong. If they've got sentence fragments or disagreements of verb tense, they'll catch them by reading aloud. But I really want them to read aloud to their friends, to trusted, intelligent friends, and to say to their friend, I'm going to read you this paper, don't praise me. Tell me what's wrong with it. Because, of course, the student's temptation is to say, oh, that was lovely. Oh, it's great. Oh, your professor's going to love that. Because that's what friends are for, is to give you some positive encouragement. But, of course, what the student needs in this context is a reminder of what's wrong with it. Another very, very useful exercise is to encourage students to write a second draft without even looking at the first one. Now, as you'll know, the reality check is that most people find it difficult to write it once, let alone twice. But if you can persuade them to write a second draft, especially a second draft where they're not looking at the first one, it'll often be beautiful, because now suddenly they're already familiar with their own argument, and they're more likely to be able to make the paragraphs follow one another logically, and for the reasoning to be internally consistent and tight. In other words, they've internalized their own arguments, and the writing is likely to flow more easily from brain to hand than it did the first agonizing time when they had to bring it all out from nowhere. Because procrastination is such a big problem, it's also a very good idea with writing projects to introduce intermediate deadlines. What you'll get is a sudden burst of activity before the outline is due, a sudden burst of activity before the first draft is due, and a sudden burst of activity before the last one is due. But at least in this way, they'll work on it over time. And when they do come back to it, the glaring inadequacies of the first version, with a bit of luck, will become more clear. As a writing teacher, I take the view that you should evaluate the students hard. You should evaluate them very critically. But at the same time, you should hold out the opportunity to them that they can rewrite. Let me read you a couple of quotations from some of the experts about the importance of rewriting. This again is from the book Tools for Teaching, which is full of good, practical, useful advice. Give students the option of revising and rewriting one assignment during the term for a higher grade. Faculty who extend this invitation to their students report that 10 to 40% of the students take advantage of it. I totally endorse that view. It's, if a student comes to you and says, can I do a rewrite? You need to decide whether you've got a policy of letting everyone do it, or whether it's only going to be available to the one who happened to ask you. And on the balance, I think you should hold out the opportunity to everyone. But it's very, very useful. And of course, writing's hard work. Editing requires discipline. Make it worth their while with an option like that. Here's a second point from the same work. In general, faculty who tell students that good writing will be rewarded and poor writing will be penalised receive better essays than instructors who don't make such demands. It's not surprising that that's true. If I weren't even to mention the writing side of things, the students wouldn't themselves be attentive to it. They'd take the view, I've got enough to worry about with the history itself. Now, this is where editing writing, it's really where you as a teacher put in a lot of hard work. It takes time and it takes discipline, and very often you have to do it one-on-one because each student's writing problems are slightly different from each other student's writing problems. When you're working with students, when you're helping them to edit, and when you're grading afterwards, there are a lot of things to consider. The quality of the argument and its persuasiveness, the logic of the presentation, the evidence that they've done adequate research, especially if they've done more than the basic required minimum of research, the grammar and the overall clarity of the work. A lot of things to think of, and you need to get the students to sort out each of those issues as distinctive. So then suppose you do offer the students the chance to rewrite. The next thing you'll find is that students will rewrite, and what they'll do is correct the particular points that you marked on the paper. But what they won't do is go through the whole paper reconceptualizing any of it. In other words, and that can be a very vexing point. Suppose that on page 1 you correct all the writing errors, and then you write, please note these characteristic writing errors for the whole of the rest of the paper. What you'll actually get is a significantly modified page 1 and a completely unmodified subsequent set of pages because you hadn't actually flagged the places where, again, they needed to make the changes. Again, let me read to you from Tools for Teaching about that point. Experienced writing teachers believe that students benefit most from a mix of marginal notations and a longer overall comment on the paper. It's also helpful if your comments guide students to rethink their ideas and prepare them to improve on the next assignment. If you do all their rewriting for them, the main thing they will learn is that you are a better writer than they are. And again, this is a point of view I totally endorse. You need to say to students when you're giving them the chance to rewrite, I've corrected some of these problems, but the problem persists all the way through. You've got to show me that you can identify the areas I haven't identified as having that characteristic problem, and that you've got to be able to set them right yourself. When they hand in the rewritten version, you should also make the students hand in the original as well, so that you can check how extensive the rewriting really was. Have they actually thought about the project all over again, or have they merely corrected the things you flagged in the hope that that's going to be sufficient? Now, of course, there's a lot to think about here. What if you yourself don't feel qualified to teach and evaluate student writing at a high level? You've got to carry on working on it as well, and we all need help with improving our writing. Even if you're unsure of your own critical abilities, you can help your students become writers simply by directing them to write regularly. I say to students, you should write a diary, because then you'll have the experience of writing full sentences every day. One of the lovely side effects of that, of course, is that later on, they'll look back on, when they're 40, they'll look back on what they wrote when they were 18 or 19 and think, look at that, I was wrong about every subject, but I clearly did believe it then. I kept a diary from the time I was 19 until I was about 42 or 3, by which time I was writing so many emails every day and keeping them that I had the same function being done in another way. Some professors ask students to write journals of their courses, recording the impressions of the work they've done. That's valuable too, as long as it's coupled periodically with more rigorous writing assignments. Email and text messaging. Students do it all the time. And although very often they're slapdash and slovenly, nevertheless it's better than in the days before email and texting existed, because at least they're doing some kind of writing. And incidentally, very often they're learning how to be concise, because when you're texting, it's good if you can make a strong point quickly. Generally, I think of writing as a dry pleasure. Let me explain what I mean by that. There's a rush of pleasure in seeing a really good theatre or a really good movie or listening to a great song. Writing's a more solitary, more disciplined activity whose social effect only becomes clear in the long run. When you've written something right, you can take pleasure in it, but it's a much more restrained kind of pleasure than the instant gratification you get from a lot of the media available to us now. It's worth saying to the students, learn to experience the dry pleasure that comes from writing. All right, now to sum up. The first draft is not supposed to be the finished work. You must encourage students to see the freedom they give themselves if they accept that their first drafts won't be final and that they're then going to do some rewriting. Students have got to learn that writing takes constant practice, diligence, patience, time, repetition, and lots of thinking. They must read their papers aloud, be self-critical, be willing to redraft papers, and to think about the vast complexity of the language itself. Now here, more than in almost every other area of education, the students have got to want to improve. If they don't want to become better writers, there's very little you can do about it, because it's so difficult. That's why it's a good idea to tell them about the magical aspect of writing, and I hope they'll catch on to that lovely idea and be more willing to spend the necessary time. And you as a teacher in this area, perhaps more than in any other, must be persistent and detailed and demanding, and simultaneously very demanding and very encouraging. Next time, we'll move on to the question of student presentations and the question of how to make them better than they usually are.